Emma Harper had just turned 28 and had already achieved much more than she imagined when she decided to study law. Raised in a small town in rural Illinois, Emma had always been determined and ambitious. She was the first in her family to attend college, and when she was accepted at the University of Chicago, she felt like the world was finally opening its doors. After graduating with honors, Emma took a job at one of the most prestigious law firms in Chicago, O'Connell Sullivan. The work was exhausting, the hours were long, but she loved every second of it. The adrenaline of the courts, the art of argument, and the feeling of fighting for something bigger kept her motivated. But little by little, Emma began to realize that the reality of the corporate world was very different from what she imagined. Most of the cases the firm took were to defend large corporations or wealthy people who were far from needing help. While Emma did her job excellently, she felt a growing discomfort. Where were the causes that really mattered? Those who needed a voice to fight for them? The social injustice that had so inspired her to pursue this career? It was in this context that Emma met Sarah Reynolds. Sarah was a single mother who had lost her job and was about to be evicted. Desperate, she sought help from O'Connell Sullivan, believing that because they were the best, they could help her. However, Sarah was rejected. The firm saw no benefit in defending someone who couldn't pay. But something about Sarah touched Emma deeply. The dignity in her voice, even in the midst of despair, and the unconditional love she showed for her children, Remy. Determined to help, Emma went to the office of John Whitmore, one of the firm's oldest and most respected partners. John was an imposing man, known for his coolness and focus on cases that generated high fees. He had been something of a mentor to Emma when she arrived at the firm, teaching her the nuances of the legal world, but also molding her to be ruthless and pragmatic. Emma entered John's office with her heart racing but determined. He explained Sarah's situation, arguing that the firm could take on the case as a pro bono action, helping to improve the company's image in the community and, at the same time, doing something morally right. John listened to her in silence, his blue eyes fixed on her, expressionless. When Emma finished, he sighed and leaned back in the leather chair, smiling condescendingly. "Emma, my dear, you are an excellent lawyer, but you still have a lot to learn," he said with an almost paternalistic tone. "This office doesn't get involved in lost causes. Our job is to advocate for those who can afford it. I understand you want to make a difference, but there are other ways to channel that idealism." Emma tried to argue, but John was adamant. He dismissed the idea of helping Sarah and suggested that Emma focus on cases that would benefit the firm, and consequently, her career. Disappointed and humiliated, Emma left the office feeling like a part of her soul was being eaten away. That night, lying in her bed, Emma reflected on her choices. She knew John was right from a business perspective, but she couldn't accept that the only way to be successful was to ignore what really mattered to her. After many sleepless nights, Emma made a radical decision. She would leave the firm and open her own office focused on causes that really mattered. In the months that followed, Emma faced a series of challenges. Leaving a renowned firm like O'Connell Sullivan meant giving up a generous salary, security, and prestige. She had to use all her savings to rent a small office on the south side of Chicago, where most people lived on the fringes of the legal system. There was no luxury or glamour. It was just Emma, an old table, and a computer. However, over time, Emma began to gain her own clientele. People who, like Sarah, had been ignored by the system, but who had a legitimate cause. She dedicated herself to each case with the same passion that had led her to law, and soon her reputation began to grow. The small community began to see her as a hero, someone who fought for the underprivileged and made a difference. Even so, the path was not easy. Emma faced financial pressures, moments of doubt, and even feelings of loneliness. Every now and then he wondered if he had made the right choice. But every time she won a case, every time she saw the gratitude in her client's eyes, she knew she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The real test came when a major corruption scandal broke in Chicago. Companies involved in government projects were being investigated for fraud, and many people lost their homes and jobs as a result of the schemes. The case became highly publicized, and Emma, with her growing reputation, was approached by a human rights organization to represent the victims. It was the kind of case that could catapult his career to another level, but it was also extremely dangerous. The companies involved had resources and power, and would not hesitate to use both to defend themselves. Even so, Emma accepted the challenge. What she didn't know was that John Whitmore, her former mentor, was deeply involved in this scandal. As a lawyer for one of the accused corporations, he was on the other side of the battle, defending those who had caused so much damage. The reunion between Emma and John in the courts was inevitable and explosive. Upon seeing John again, Emma felt a mix of emotions. The man who had despised her, who had taught her to be pragmatic and cold, was now on the other side of a cause she knew was just. And John, in turn, was surprised to see how Emma had grown into a powerful and determined lawyer. In court, the two fought an intense battle. Emma dedicated her heart and soul to exposing the truth, while John used every trick possible to protect his clients. The media followed every step of the process, making Emma a public figure and intensifying the pressure on her. And then in the middle of the trial, Emma discovered something that would change everything. Emma was at the height of the legal battle, facing John Whitmore and his team of powerful lawyers. The pressure was immense, and each day in court felt like a mountain to climb. Despite the emotional and physical exhaustion, Emma remained strong. She knew she was fighting for something bigger than herself. He was representing people who had been deceived and left on the sidelines by those in power. As the trial progressed, Emma and her team began to uncover evidence that proved corruption at several corporations involved in the scandal. Confidential documents were leaked, showing how these companies manipulated government contracts and embezzled millions of dollars that should have been invested in infrastructure and public services. One afternoon, after another exhausting day in court, Emma was reviewing newly received documents in her office when something caught her eye. Amid a pile of old contracts, she found a memo that mentioned a secret meeting between executives of the investigated companies and a consultant lawyer. John Whitmore's name was not explicitly mentioned, but Emma recognized his discreet signature on one of the pages. His heart raced. It was the first direct link between John and the corruption scheme. If she could prove John's involvement, not only would she win the case, but she would destroy the career of the man who had despised her and represented everything she despised about the law. Emma felt torn. The discovery could change the course of the trial and deliver justice for the victims, but it also meant exposing John in a way that could destroy his personal and professional life. As much as he was an opponent, John had been his mentor and in some ways responsible for some of his success. She knew that the decision she made at that moment would have irreversible consequences. The next day, Emma called her team together for an emergency meeting. They discussed the strategy for using the new document in court, but Emma was distracted. His thoughts were on how this revelation would affect everything, especially his relationship with John, even if he was now purely antagonistic. When the trial resumed, Emma asked the judge for permission to present the new evidence. John, on the other side of the room, looked suspicious, but maintained the cool composure that had always characterized him. When Emma revealed the document to the court, the room fell silent. Everyone knew it was a bomb. John kept his gaze fixed on Emma as she presented the evidence, but his expression betrayed a brief moment of surprise. Emma felt a tightness in her chest, but continued. The judge accepted the evidence, and the mood in the courtroom changed drastically. The jurors now had in their hands concrete proof of the involvement of someone of John Whitmore's caliber in the corrupt scheme. In the following days, the media jumped on the story. Headlines featured John's name in corruption scandals, and O'Connell Sullivan's reputation was severely damaged. John, who had always been the embodiment of success and professional integrity, now had his image tarnished forever. Emma, on the other hand, was hailed as a hero by the press and legal community. His name was everywhere, and offers from big law firms started coming in. However, despite her imminent victory, Emma did not feel completely fulfilled. One afternoon, while in his office, John came to her. He looked different, less confident, almost defeated. Emma allowed him to enter, and for a moment, the two were silent, looking at each other. The tension between them was palpable, but there was something more, something Emma couldn't quite put her finger on. "So, that's it?" John finally spoke, his voice deep and tired. "You won. It's not about winning, John. Emma replied, trying to remain calm. "This is about justice." "Justice," he repeated as if the word had a bitter taste in his mouth. "You've always been like this, idealistic. Maybe that's why I chose her to replace me one day." Those words caught Emma by surprise. She never imagined that John saw her this way, as someone to take her place. "But look where that got us," he continued. "You destroyed me, Emma. And why? To get revenge? To prove that you're better than me?" Emma shook her head, feeling the inner turmoil growing. "I didn't do it out of revenge, John. I did it because it was right." "The right one?" John gave a sad laugh. "And what is right in this world? Do you think that these same principles that you defend were not used against me? Against all of us? Justice, as you see, is an illusion, a facade. And one day you will see this too." Emma felt a chill. She didn't know if John was trying to manipulate her or if he really believed the words he was saying. "I'm not like you, John," she said firmly, "and I never will be." "No, you're already worse," he said, his voice full of bitterness. "Because you believe you are above all that, and that is dangerous." With those words, John turned and left the office, leaving Emma alone with her thoughts. The doubt he planted in his mind began to grow. Was she really doing the right thing? Could it be that, in the end, she was just feeding her own ego, trying to prove that she was better than John? In the days that followed, Emma delved even deeper into the case, trying to dispel these doubts. But the more she investigated, the more she discovered about the depths of the corruption she was fighting. And to his surprise, he realized that John wasn't the only one to blame. There were others involved, people she would never have imagined, including some of her allies. The final revelation came when Emma discovered that some of the evidence she had used in the trial had been manipulated. Someone within the very human rights organization that had hired her was using the case to further their own goals. The evidence against John and the others had been planted to ensure a quick and sensational conviction, regardless of true justice. Emma was devastated. All his effort, all the sacrifice he had made, seemed to have been in vain. She was now in a position where the truth she held dear was being distorted and used for political and personal ends. And the worst part, she had been a pawn in someone more powerful's game. Emma was faced with a choice: expose this manipulation and risk losing the case, perhaps even her career, or continue with the trial and accept that even if she won, she would not be acting with complete integrity. Finally, on the day of sentencing, Emma made the most difficult decision of her life. She stood up in court and, in front of everyone, revealed the manipulation of evidence. He confessed that despite the evidence against John and the others, there were doubts about the legitimacy of some of it. He asked the judge to reconsider the case and for new investigations to be carried out. The courtroom was silent. John looked at Emma, this time without anger, but with something that seemed like respect. He knew that by doing this, Emma was sacrificing everything she had worked for, but she was also staying true to her principles. The judge, after considering Emma's words, decided to suspend the trial and open a new investigation. It was a bitter victory. Emma had saved her integrity, but lost the case and saw her career put at risk. The media, which had previously praised her, now criticized her for having ruined a certain victory. But as she walked out of the courtroom, Emma felt an inner peace she hadn't felt in a long time. She knew that, in the end, she had done the right thing, even if it meant losing everything, and perhaps that would be the greatest victory of all. After the trial was suspended, Emma saw her life turned upside down. The decision to expose the manipulation of evidence had been an act of courage, but also of sacrifice. His once brilliant reputation was now in ruins. The media that previously praised her now fiercely criticized her, calling her naive and irresponsible. His former colleagues at the firm, and even some of his new clients, began to walk away. In the days that followed, Emma felt the weight of the consequences of her actions. His small office, once bustling with new cases, was now virtually empty. The bills started piling up, and the financial pressure came back to haunt her. But what bothered her most was the silence. The phone, which had previously rang incessantly, now seemed to be in a kind of mourning along with her. Still, Emma knew she had done what was right. The integrity he had always valued had been preserved, but at a huge cost. Meanwhile, the new investigation into the corruption scandal continued, and she was removed from the case. For Emma, the exclusion was a hard blow, but she understood that her credibility was shaken, and this was something she would have to regain over time. While trying to reorganize her life, Emma received an unexpected visitor. It was Sarah Reynolds, the single mother who had unwittingly been the catalyst for this entire journey. Sarah had been one of Emma's first clients, and now she stood there in the doorway of her office with a warm smile, carrying a basket of food and flowers. "I heard what happened," Sarah said, entering Emma's cluttered office. "And I just wanted to say thank you. I know you lost a lot, but you also set an example for all of us. You taught me to fight for what is right, no matter the cost." Sarah's words were a balm to Emma's soul. As much as she was going through difficulties, hearing that reminded her of the purpose for which she had started this journey. She invited Sarah to sit down, and the two spent the afternoon talking about life, challenges, and how sometimes the most important victories aren't recognized right away. Days later, something unexpected happened. An envelope arrived at Emma's office, addressed to her but with no return address. Inside was a handwritten letter and a check for a significant amount. The letter was brief, but what was written changed everything. "Emma, you were the only one to show true courage and integrity in this case. In a world where everyone is ready to sacrifice their values for an easy victory, you chose the harder path. Don't think this went unnoticed. This check is an investment for the future. Use it wisely. You still have a lot to do." "A friend." Emma was perplexed. There was no signature, and the style of writing was unfamiliar to him. But the check was legitimate, and the amount could cover her expenses for months, perhaps even allow her to expand her office. However, the mystery behind the letter left her uneasy. Who could have sent that, and why? Determining the origin of the check became a new mission for Emma. Using her contacts, she was able to track down the issuing bank, but the information was limited. All he could discover was that the transaction had been made by an anonymous investment fund. This only added to the mystery. While investigating the origin of the money, Emma received a phone call that took her by surprise. It was from someone she never expected to hear from again, John Whitmore. "We need to talk," John said in a serious voice. "There is something you need to know." Emma hesitated. After everything that had happened, I didn't know if I was ready to face John again, but curiosity and the need to understand what was happening were stronger. They arranged to meet at a discreet cafe in downtown Chicago. When she arrived at the cafe, Emma found John sitting at a table in the corner away from the windows. He looked more tired than ever, the marks of the legal battle and public exposure visible on his face. "You really did some damage, you know that?" he said with a half smile when Emma sat down opposite him. "I did what was right," she replied bluntly. "Yes, and that's why I respect her," John admitted, surprising her. "But what you don't know is that there is much more to this story than you realize." Emma stayed silent, waiting for him to continue. "After you exposed the manipulation of evidence, I started doing my own investigation. I discovered that someone was using both you and me as pawns in a much larger game. The real corruption was not just between corporations and the government. There is an underground network of powerful financiers and business people who are manipulating cases and even investigations to ensure that the results serve their interests." Emma felt a chill. John's words confirmed what she feared, that everything she had fought against was just the tip of a much larger iceberg. "And where do I come into this?" Emma asked, trying to process the new information. "You were chosen because you were the opposite of me, an idealist, a clean voice amidst the dirt. They knew that by using you, they could divert attention from where the real rot was. And when you discovered the manipulation, you only became an even more valuable piece in their game. Now, you are seen as a martyr for justice, but all of this was calculated so that they could continue acting in the shadows, without anyone suspecting." Emma was stunned. The feeling of having been manipulated, of having been used, was unbearable. She had lost so much, fought so much, and for what? To be a puppet in a game you didn't even know you were playing? "But why are you telling me this now?" she asked, suspicious. John paused, looking deeply into Emma's eyes. "Because I was used too, and I'm tired of it. I spent my entire life believing I controlled my destiny. But now I see that I was just a piece on a board that I never fully understood. I lost everything, Emma. My reputation, my career, my dignity. And now I want to settle the score." Emma could tell that John was sincerely sorry. There was a sadness and a truth in his words that she couldn't ignore. "And what do you suggest?" she asked, with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. "We need to expose who is really behind this," John said with a decisive tone. "But we can't do this alone. We need to gather evidence, alliances, and we need someone who still has credibility to lead this investigation. And despite everything, Emma, you are that person." Emma was silent, pondering John's words. If he was telling the truth, that meant there was a conspiracy much bigger than any of them could imagine. But at the same time, joining forces with John, even with his seemingly genuine intentions, was something she needed to consider very carefully. However, one thing was certain. Emma couldn't just ignore what she knew now. Her fight for justice had become something much bigger, and she needed to decide how to proceed. The choice she makes would not only define her future, but it could also change the fate of many. As she left the cafe that night, Emma knew she was at a crucial turning point. The path ahead would be dangerous and uncertain, but it was also the only one that made sense to her right now. It was time to face the shadows that were manipulating the system and fight for real justice, no matter how high the cost. After her conversation with John Whitmore, Emma felt like she was walking through a minefield. The reality of what I was facing was frightening. She had been thrown into a power game much greater than she had imagined, and now she needed to decide how to act. There was a network of influence and corruption far beyond the court and companies he had initially investigated, and everything indicated that his battle was just beginning. In the days that followed, Emma began to prepare for the new stage of the fight. She knew she needed allies, but also that she needed to be extremely cautious about who she trusted. John had promised to help her, but the scars of his betrayal were still fresh. Even with her apparent redemption, Emma knew that depending on him completely would be a mistake. She began to gather her team once again, people she knew she could trust even if there were only a few of them. Sarah Reynolds, who had always believed in Emma, became her confidant and emotional support, helping her stay focused when doubts arose. Emma also sought support from former colleagues who had left O'Connell Sullivan before the scandal, lawyers who, like her, had become disillusioned with the corporate world and wanted to make a difference. One of those people was Laura Jackson, a private investigator Emma had met during her time at the firm. Laura had an impeccable reputation for her ability to uncover secrets no one else could. She accepted Emma's invitation without hesitation, drawn by the opportunity to overthrow a corrupt system that she herself had witnessed throughout her career. Together, Emma, Laura, and Sarah began to devise a plan. They knew they needed solid evidence to expose those in the shadows, but they also knew that this evidence would not be easy to find. Furthermore, time was not on their side. Any misstep could alert her enemies, and Emma knew they would not hesitate to act to silence her. Emma and Laura spent sleepless nights reviewing documents, making connections, and trying to identify weak points in the corruption network. With each new discovery, it became clearer that the problem was much deeper than they imagined. Companies, politicians, and even members of the judiciary were involved in a scheme of embezzlement of public funds and money laundering that spread across the country. Meanwhile, John continued to provide information from the inside, but always cautiously, aware that he could be under surveillance. He had begun to question everything he knew about the system he had helped build, and in the midst of the chaos, he found in Emma a kind of purpose. Together they formed a tense alliance, united by a common desire to expose the truth. Emma's first big victory came when Laura got a crucial lead. A former employee of one of the companies involved in the scheme, willing to testify in exchange for protection. It was a man named David Thompson, who had been an accountant at one of the corporations. He knew inside details about how money laundering operations were carried out and was willing to talk as long as his safety was guaranteed. Emma knew that this testimony could be the key to cracking the case, but also that protecting David would be a difficult task. There were powerful forces that didn't want him to speak, and his life was at risk. Determined to protect her witness, Emma arranged for David to be placed in protective custody while they prepared their statement. Meanwhile, Emma and John faced a growing dilemma. The closer they got to the truth, the more it became clear that exposing everything would put many lives in danger, including Emma's. The threats began to appear in the form of anonymous phone calls, frightening messages left at his office, and finally an attempted break-in at his home. Emma, however, refused to back down. Each threat only strengthened his determination to expose the culprits. But this fight was beginning to take a heavy toll. She became more paranoid, more suspicious, and her relationships with those around her began to suffer. Sarah, always a pillar of support, tried to calm her, but Emma was consumed by the mission she now saw as her sole reason for existing. The pressure on Emma culminated when David Thompson disappeared from protective custody. The news fell like a bomb. Emma was devastated, feeling like the case was falling apart. If I couldn't find him, the entire operation would be at risk. She knew that the enemies were moving faster than she could keep up, and that she was now against time to prevent the case from becoming another failure statistic. Laura, with her skill and contacts, began looking for David in every possible place. After days of incessant searching, they finally discovered that he had been kidnapped by mercenaries hired by those who wanted to guarantee his silence. But there was a twist. David was alive and being kept in a safe house outside the city, where they hoped to solve the problem definitively. Emma, Laura, and John planned a risky operation to rescue David before it was too late. John used his old contacts and influence to organize a rescue team, while Laura investigated every detail of the location and the mercenaries involved. It was a desperate operation, but they knew they had no choice. The night of the rescue was tense and full of adrenaline. Emma had never been involved in anything so dangerous before, and every minute felt like an eternal test of nerves. When they finally arrived at the house where David was being held, they found him tied up and visibly traumatized but alive. The operation was quick, and before the mercenaries could react, Emma and her team managed to get David out of there safely. The rescue was a success, but not without consequences. David was deeply shaken, and it would be difficult to get his testimony after the trauma he had experienced. However, he knew his only chance of survival was to collaborate with Emma and ensure the network of corruption was exposed. In the days that followed, Emma prepared David for his testimony. She knew he was the final piece she needed to ensure the conviction of the guilty. But as he organized everything, a nagging question began to creep into his mind. John Whitmore. As much as he was helping, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more behind her sudden redemption. The night before David's testimony, Emma confronted John. They were alone in her office, and the atmosphere was charged with tension. "John, I need to know the truth," Emma began, her voice firm. "Are you really on my side, or is there something you haven't told me yet?" John stared at her in silence for a moment, and Emma saw something in his eyes that made her question everything. "Emma, I'm trying to do right, just like you," he said, with a tone of voice that seemed sincere but carried a shadow of doubt. "But you need to understand that in this game, there are no heroes. I've done things I regret, things you may never forgive me for. But the only thing I can do now is try to fix what's wrong." Emma felt there was more, but before she could press it, John interrupted her. "Tomorrow will be the decisive moment. If we can get David to testify, we can bring down this entire network of corruption. But we need to be ready for the consequences. They won't go down without a fight, and you know it." Emma knew he was right. She had to focus on David's testimony, on the end goal. But that night left a shadow in his heart. The next day, the courtroom was packed. Journalists, cameras, lawyers, and observers filled the room, waiting for the testimony that could change the course of everything. Emma was nervous, but determined. David entered the room with visible nervousness, but she reassured him with a firm look. As the testimony began, David revealed everything he knew: the money laundering schemes, the bribes, the secret meetings. He mentioned names, dates, places. Every word felt like a nail in the coffin of those who had tried to silence him. But then in the middle of the testimony, something happened. David stopped, hesitated, and the silence in the room became deafening. Emma felt a chill run down her spine. He was beginning to talk about a specific meeting, one that involved the highest echelons of politics and business, when suddenly, He began to shake. His words became incoherent and he fell to the floor. Panic gripped the courtroom. Emma ran to David, but it was too late. He was dead, apparently poisoned. Confusion and chaos engulfed the venue, and the live broadcast was abruptly cut off. Emma stood there kneeling beside David with tears in her eyes, as the reality of the situation hit her like a punch. They had lost their key witness, and with it, perhaps, the chance to bring down the network of corruption. John approached Emma, placing a hand on her shoulder. He looked as shaken as she felt, but there was a determination in his eyes. "It's not over, Emma," he said, his voice firm but with a hint of desperation. "We need to continue. There's more at stake here than just the two of us. If we can't expose them through court, we will find another way." Emma knew he was right, but at that moment all seemed lost. She had come so close only to see everything fall apart before her eyes. But in the back of his mind, a new determination began to emerge. She knew that even if she had to face even more adversity, she couldn't give up. There was still one chance, one last card to be played, and this time, she would do it her way. The courtroom was silent except for the muffled sound of footsteps and murmurs as people tried to process what had just happened. The shock of David Thompson's death hung in the air, leaving everyone present in a state of disbelief and panic. Emma remained kneeling beside David's body, feeling the crushing weight of failure. All his fighting, the sacrifice, and now his key witness was dead, murdered before his eyes. John Whitmore, who had been by Emma's side all this time, helped her to her feet. His eyes were darkened with anger and fear. He knew that if David had been killed, the same people who did it would not hesitate to come after Emma and him. "We need to get out of here now," he said, pulling Emma by the arm. But Emma was paralyzed. His mind was running in 1,000 directions, trying to find a solution, some way to regain control. She had prepared herself to face everything, but she wasn't ready for this. Still, she knew John was right. They couldn't stay there. Together, they walked out of the courtroom amid the chaos, and John took her to safety, an old apartment he kept in a low-key Chicago neighborhood. The place was simple, far from the luxury John was used to, but it was discreet, and most importantly, safe. While Emma recovered from the shock, John began to devise a plan. He knew they needed to act quickly, before the enemies managed to cover up all the remaining evidence. "They're going to try to clean it up now, Emma," he said as he moved nervously around the apartment. "We need to be faster than them." Emma looked at John, trying to find some clarity amidst the chaos. David's death had been a devastating blow, but it had also left a clue. The poison used was sophisticated, something that only a very well-connected group could obtain and use without being detected. This meant that no matter how hard those responsible were trying to hide, they had left a trail. "We need to find out who supplied the poison and how it was transported," Emma said, beginning to piece together a plan. "If we can track this, we can get to those responsible." John agreed, and the two got to work immediately. With the help of Laura Jackson, who was still on the case, they were able to trace the chemicals used in the poisoning. It was a rare type of poison, difficult to obtain, and the clues led them to a network of smugglers operating in the shadows of Chicago. Laura, with her experience in investigation, managed to infiltrate the network, pretending to be a buyer interested in exclusive merchandise. The weeks that followed were a tense game of cat and mouse as she tried to obtain information without arousing suspicion. John used his contacts to ensure they had the resources needed to pursue the investigation, while Emma prepared what could be her last move. Finally, Laura got a clue. She discovered that the poison had been ordered by a shell company linked to one of the corporations Emma had investigated earlier in the case. The connection was clear. This company was directly involved in the corruption network, and someone within it had authorized the murder of David Thompson to ensure his silence. With this information in hand, Emma knew she had what she needed to expose the truth. But there was one last problem. The enemies knew they were being pursued, and they would not hesitate to act again, this time perhaps directly against Emma and her team. Time was running out, and they needed a strategy that would ensure the truth came out definitively and irrefutably. It was then that John suggested something unexpected. "We need to get this out to the public once and for all," he said. "They control the courts, the media, the companies. But if we expose everything in a way that they can't hide, it will be impossible for them to erase it. Emma looked at him, trying to understand what John was proposing. How do you intend to do that? She asked, curious but also cautious. With a live broadcast, John replied. We will expose all the evidence we have, all the documents, all the recordings. Let's take this directly to the people, without filters, without intermediaries. If we do this fast enough, they won't have time to react. The idea was bold, but it made sense. If they were able to broadcast live to a large audience, those responsible would have no way of covering up the truth before it came out. They needed to organize everything in a matter of hours, because once the broadcast started, there would be no turning back. Emma knew she was risking everything, but she also knew there was no other choice. She agreed to John's plan, and they began preparing. With Laura's help, they managed to guarantee a safe platform for the transmission, which would be publicized through social media and through the few reliable contacts they still had in the media. On the night of the broadcast, Emma, John, and Laura were ready. In John's small apartment, they set up the necessary equipment and connected the evidence. Documents, audio recordings, images, everything was organized to be presented to the public. Emma took a deep breath before starting. He knew that this could be the most important moment of his life, the culmination of everything he had fought for. But he also knew that if he failed, the consequences would be devastating. With the cameras on and the signal live, Emma began to speak. His voice was firm but charged with emotion. She told the story from the beginning, from the Sarah Reynolds case to the investigation that led her to uncover the corruption network. He explained all the details without omitting anything, and as he spoke, the evidence was shown to the audience. The broadcast quickly began to gain momentum. Within minutes, thousands of people were watching, and the number continued to grow. While Emma spoke, John and Laura monitored the situation, ready to act if something went wrong. As the broadcast continued, those responsible for the corruption began to realize what was happening. They tried to knock down the sign, but Laura had prepared herself for that. Each time an attempt was made, it redirected the broadcast to another platform, ensuring the truth continued to come out. The audience continued to grow, and soon news networks began picking up the signal and broadcasting it live as well. What began as a desperate attempt to expose the truth has turned into a national movement. People across the country began to see what was really going on, and public pressure began to mount rapidly. When Emma finally finished speaking, the truth was exposed for all to see. She knew those responsible would try to react, but it was too late now. Public opinion was on their side, and the authorities, pressured by popular outcry, would have no choice but to act. In the days following the broadcast, a series of investigations were launched. High-ranking people began to be arrested, and the corruption network began to collapse. The media, which had initially criticized Emma, now exalted her as a hero, someone who had risked everything to ensure justice was served. John Whitmore, who had played a crucial role in exposing the truth, decided it was time to step away from the legal world for good. He knew that despite his good intentions, he had contributed to building the corrupt system that was now being dismantled. Before leaving, he said goodbye to Emma, thanking her for showing him that despite everything, there was still room for redemption. Emma, in turn, was left with a bittersweet feeling. He had won the battle, but the cost had been high. David Thompson, who had given his life to ensure the truth was revealed, would never be forgotten. And Emma herself knew that although she had managed to expose the corruption, the work of truly changing the system was just beginning. But now she was ready. With her confidence restored and the public's support, Emma decided to continue her fight for justice, this time with more allies than ever before. She knew the road ahead would be long and full of challenges, but now she was stronger, more determined and more aware than ever. The victory was not complete, but it was an important step. And as Emma looked to the future, she knew that no matter what adversity she faced, she would never give up fighting for what she believed in. Time had passed since the explosive live broadcast that dismantled the network of corruption that dominated Chicago. Emma Harper's life was never the same. The media furore subsided, but the consequences of his courage and determination continued to reverberate. Emma became a national name, respected and admired by many, but also feared by those who still had something to hide. The exposure of corruption led to a wave of investigations across the country, and many other similar crime networks began to be dismantled. But with success came new challenges. The small office that Emma had founded grew quickly. People from far and wide sought her help, believing that if anyone could bring justice to them, it was Emma. She now led a larger team, made up of idealistic lawyers who shared her vision, experienced investigators like Laura Jackson, and even financial advisors who helped track down the dirty money. However, growth also brought its pains. Emma found herself increasingly overwhelmed, juggling the demands of a growing office on top of the responsibilities of being a public figure. The pressure was constant, and she felt increasingly isolated, even though she was surrounded by people who admired her. John Whitmore, true to his desire to step away from the world of law, has disappeared from the spotlight. Before leaving, he gave Emma a letter, thanking her for helping him see the truth and wishing her success in the mission she would continue to undertake. There was something melancholy in his words, an acceptance that his time had passed, but also a hope that Emma could do what he couldn't. Despite everything, Emma missed her old mentor. No matter how difficult the path had been, John had played a crucial role in her life, both for good and for bad. And now, without him around, she wondered if she could continue without losing her own essence. While dealing with these feelings, a new opportunity arose. A group of progressive activists and politicians began pressuring Emma to run for public office. They believed that, with her reputation, she could take the changes she advocated for to the legislative level, helping to create laws that would prevent networks of corruption like the one she dismantled from emerging again. The idea tempted her. If it were directly involved in politics, it could have the resources and influence necessary to combat corruption more effectively. But at the same time, he knew that entering politics meant entering another kind of game, one that could compromise his principles and his integrity. While reflecting on this decision, Emma received an unexpected visit from Sarah Reynolds. Sarah, who had been the start of it all, had become a close friend and a constant reminder of why Emma had started this journey. "What are you going to do now?" asked Sarah as the two had coffee in Emma's new office. "I don't know," Emma admitted, looking out the window at the city skyline. "The idea of entering politics is tempting, but at the same time, I'm afraid of getting lost in it, of ending up like so many others who started with good intentions and then became corrupt." Sarah smiled slightly, understanding. "You faced greater challenges, Emma, and whatever you decide, I know you will do what is right, but remember, you don't have to do this alone. There are people who believe in you, who are here to support you. Don't forget that." Sarah's words touched Emma deeply. She knew that, no matter how much responsibility weighed on her shoulders, she was not alone on this journey. She had built a team of dedicated people who shared her vision and who would help her no matter which path she chose. However, the doubt still persisted. Emma didn't want to be another political figure worn down by the system. Her desire had always been to fight injustice, but she knew that politics could be a minefield of compromises and concessions that she was unwilling to make. Finally, after much thought, Emma made her decision. In a live-streamed press conference, an echo of the broadcast that had changed her life, she announced that she would not enter politics. Instead, she would continue to expand her work as a lawyer and activist, focusing on strengthening existing laws and systems as well as educating the public about their rights and the importance of transparency in government. "My place is here, fighting directly with people and for people," said Emma during the conference. "Change starts with each of us, and together we can build a fairer system without compromising our values." The reaction was mixed. Some were disappointed, expecting her to become a political force. Others, especially those who had followed her from the beginning, admired her decision to stay true to her principles. Emma continued her work with renewed determination. Under her leadership, the office expanded its operations, and she became an active voice in defending human rights and fighting corruption across the country. And although he knew the battle would never be easy, he also knew he was on the right path. The case of David Thompson and the network of corruption in Chicago have become a landmark in the country's history, reminding everyone of the power of truth and the importance of fighting injustice, no matter how difficult or dangerous it may be. In the end, Emma Harper had become more than a lawyer. She had become a symbol of integrity and courage, someone who was not afraid to stand up to the powerful and fight for what she believed was right. And as she looked to the future, she knew that although the fight for justice was eternal, she would never give up. A few years have passed since Emma Harper dismantled the network of corruption that rocked Chicago. The office she founded grew, becoming a national reference in human rights cases and combating corruption. Emma continued her tireless fight, but now with a dedicated team and resources she could only dream of before. Sarah Reynolds, now working alongside Emma, has become a powerful voice advocating for underserved communities. Together, they created programs that helped people understand and protect their rights, ensuring that stories like Sarah's were never ignored again. John Whitmore, although retired from law, continued his life in peace. He never returned to the spotlight, but his name was still remembered as an important part in the fall of corruption. Emma never forgot her contribution, no matter how troubled their relationship was. One quiet morning, Emma, standing in her office, looked out the window at the city she loved so much. The sun was shining, and she felt an inner peace that she hadn't experienced in a long time. I knew the fight would never end, but I also knew I was ready for whatever came. After all, the truth would always find its way, and she would be there to ensure it.